Hello, everybody. Good morning. I am in Minneapolis. I've reached one of my primary destinations on this trip. If you follow me on Twitter, which I can't imagine why you would not, I mean, you have to be a giant loser not to do that at this point. You'll know that yesterday afternoon and evening I spent a number of hours traversing various parts of Minneapolis, speaking to people, including at the George Floyd death site, which is now George Floyd Plaza, or at least locally referred to as George Floyd Plaza. So you have a number of blocks now which are effectively like a self-governing autonomous zone. Not quite like the situation in Seattle where it's a self-proclaimed like anarchist initiative. This is just local activists who have walled off vehicular traffic to the area where George Floyd was killed, and you have large memorials that sprouted up that are almost seem professionally done. I'm not trying to be conspiratorial there. I'm just saying there was a lot of elaborate effort that went into the construction of these memorials, and you have people on tables all across on the boundaries of this area, kind of guarding it. There are patrols, like civilian patrols, that kind of go around the perimeter, and it's open to the public. I mean, anybody can walk in, but it's monitored through a kind of nebulous civilian type force, and it's almost become like a tourist attraction. I mean, actually, I spoke to an activist who was one of the most vocal people there. You can go watch the video on this channel where she's observing and trying to interpret or process how this site became like a national destination for people to make pilgrimages to. And talk about religious overtones. There are people around Minneapolis right now who've made a pilgrimage hundreds and hundreds of miles. Like there was somebody who was talking about how she came from Texas, somebody who came from South Florida. I mean, that's a long ways away from Minneapolis, both of those. But yet they've come to Minneapolis. I think actually some of them drove. I think they said they drove actually, yeah. And look, I drove from Jersey City, so I drove a long way too. But I don't have the same type of religious impulse, I would say, as lots of these people who feel like it's some kind of duty on their part as moral citizens to pay homage to this site. But it has become sort of a tourist attraction. So you see just tons of people, largely white, but not exclusively, obviously, coming through and taking photos, posing, like doing selfies in front of the George Floyd Memorial. I don't know. It reminds me of how like people sometimes take selfies at Auschwitz. Okay, not the same scale. Okay, but it's similar incongruity in terms of whether it's quote appropriate to take selfies in that context. But anyway, I mean, it's interesting to observe, and it's actually labeled sacred ground. I'm recording on my phone right now, so I can't pull up the photo. But as you enter one of the points of entry into this plaza, there's a sign that says this is sacred ground, something to that effect. So it is imbued explicitly with a highly religious overtone. And now you have this Christian revival group, which has sort of set up shop in this plaza. And I did an interview with a guy associated with that, also on the channel. where he's talking about how he's extremely hopeful and almost and proud that this revival group, which came together non-denominationally, so you have it's what would be called a syncretic movement of sorts. Syncretic, if you're not familiar, is just sort of the fusion of disparate elements together toward a common purpose or bond or something like that, which is often a feature of how religion progresses sociologically. Like the people adopt or borrow aspects of differing religious sects. Obviously, there are still many religious sects that are not inclined to engage in syncreticism. The more traditionalist sects, definitely a lot of Catholic traditionalists. But here it's just kind of fill in the blank Christianity, where you have a tub of water where people who just happen to be passing through can be baptized and accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. So, although it's syncretic, it has some of the features that you would associate primarily with American evangelical Christianity. I've been to bona fide American evangelical Christian events where a key component is that you have people who haven't fully accepted Jesus come before the public, confess their sins, and then are dumped sometimes backwards like this into a lake or to a pool or of some kind, and they're baptized, and then they've accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior. That's what's going on at the George Floyd death site, okay? So, I mean, it's interesting to say the least. And that's an overtly Christian thing. So you have an element of religiosity that's overtaken a lot of this, quote, movement that's more civic or secular religion, where they have this pantheon of martyr figures. I actually wrote a piece on this for The Spectator a few days ago, which I'll link to in the description box once I'm done with the video. But definitely very prominent within how this movement is materialized is secular civic religiosity. So you have collective worship, where people raising their hands to the sky. That's modeled after the hands up, don't shoot, but like it's the same exact pose that evangelical Christians use when they're doing worship songs. I mean, I'm glad that I've attended and observed many of those evangelical Christian events because it's the same exact posture. It just is. Kneeling in solemn reflection. Public requests for absolution and salvation, confession of sins, belief in a kind of original sin, that being white supremacy. White supremacy is the original sin that can never be fully discarded or moved beyond. So that's why you have to be in a constant state of repentance. Just in a similar way as you would with many forms of Christianity. I mean, it's interesting just in terms of the evolution of religion. I mean, there's a book by Bob Wright that runs Blogging Heads called The Evolution of God, which I read probably, maybe 9 or 10 years ago at this point, and he just talks about, and it's a comprehensive, exhaustive, anthropological analysis of how religions have evolved over the course of history. And man, you see a lot of the kind of foundations of the religious impulse on display at these protests and events and outdoor gatherings and commemorations and prayer gatherings and stuff. So that, I mean, it gives you a very much a sense that a lot of these actions or behaviors are kind of, in a way, foundational or fundamental to just the human impulse, and they manifest then in different forms of religion around the world, with one form of religion that is now manifesting being American activist religion around Black Lives Matter or around this protest movement, which is like even not confined to Black Lives Matter as a phrase. I mean, it's beyond that. Yeah, so, and when I say that, you should read the piece, which is not comprehensive. I mean, I could have written probably thousands of words more, and I hopefully will at some point. But when I say it's state-backed religion, I'm not saying that, obviously, the American federal government or any other government has officially codified Black Lives Matter or anything related to this kind of anti-racism stuff as an official religion that would violate the Establishment Clause of the American Constitution. But if you're familiar at all with how American religion is operated within the public sphere, you know that that doesn't inhibit necessarily public officials, elected officials, etc., from embracing wholeheartedly and fulsomely many aspects of religion within their kind of state operations. You have a prayer breakfast meeting that occurs every year in, I think, January or February in Washington, D.C. that the president often addresses, etc. So when I say it's state-backed, I'm not saying it's been established formally as a state religion. Obviously, it's not possible. But there's a long-standing theory in the sociology of American religion that the lack of a state-established religion has actually led to the relative flourishment of religion in the United States compared to other countries that do have an established religion, like, for example, the UK, where the UK on a whole is more secular than the US. Anyway, but like, for example, so you have the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, within days, ordering a plaza near the White House renamed Black Lives Matter Plaza officially. So it's on the street sign now. It's painted in bright yellow lettering on the street. Name me a protest movement ever. Maybe there is one and I'm just not familiar with it. Let me know. Email me or Twitter me or whatever. Or leave a comment. I'm on YouTube right now. But name me a protest movement that has ever been memorialized on a public throughway within days of it bursting onto the scene. I defy you to name me an example. I very much doubt that it exists. You have many examples like that around the country. Same thing happened, I believe, in Brooklyn. Bill de Blasio, the mayor, ordered that. And there are probably others that I don't have off the top of my head. And also, it's state-backed because it was done with the encouragement, not just, okay, it was many of these protests have been conducted not just with the tacit sanction of elected officials, so not just with elected officials say, you know what, we're going to just permit this to happen, but with the active and avowed and passionate encouragement and participation of elected officials. And why is that significant? Because the gatherings, these mass gatherings are in many jurisdictions still, to this day, illegal. They are a violation of the law. But there are places in the United States, many, where mayors and governors and Congress people violated the laws that are on the books pertaining to mitigation or containment of the pandemic. So if they feel such a moral fervor around this issue, if they feel that it's such an imperative to go out themselves as governors, as congressmen, as mayors, as council members, if it's such an imperative for them to go participate even in direct violation of the laws that are on the books related to a historic, once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, that tells you that there's a religious drive that is behind this. Otherwise, presumably, or maybe not, but you would think that they would take a moment to sit back and rationally kind of assess the situation. Saying, you know what, we just spent 3 months berating and haranguing people, and in many cases using the power of the state to punish people for holding mass gatherings. So, for example, in Illinois, you can't gather with 10 or more people. You just can't, according to the governor's order. And yet, I mean, in Illinois a few weeks ago, or like a week or two ago, and you have these enormous gatherings. There was just another one on yesterday, Sunday, which was a Black Trans Lives thing. It was enormous. You can go look at the photos. The law on the books in Illinois is 10 people. Okay? And I'm not saying that everybody who gathers with more than 10 people needs to be thrown into jail. But I'm saying if these laws are just being flouted with total abandon at the direct encouragement of the people who signed the law into effect, then that means there's a zeal here that is got to be religious in nature in my mind, and it is if you just look at the conduct of the people who are participating in this movement. I mean, what is another? The list is infinite. What is a feature of religious movements? Well, you cast out heretics, right? You ostracize those who violate some aspect of your dogma or don't adhere to your dogma. And we see that happening across countless sectors of society right now, where people have some kind of transgression in the past or transgression now, and they're being cast out. They're being made to publicly confess and repent. I'm sorry, it's just religious. And I hope, I mean, one of the things that I have studied in the past and written about is just American religion. And if you're not familiar with the history there, then you're missing a huge element of what is on display at the moment. And so that's the sense in which I labeled this a state-backed religion. But in the case of this Christian revival movement happening at the George Floyd Plaza, that's a little different, where it's a more overtly Christian movement, which is like a side thing that has arisen. Anyway, so I named this video after the ongoing debate about whether the protests are a factor, or to what extent the protests are a factor in the spike in coronavirus cases or COVID-19 cases now that we're seeing in many parts of the country. And you got to be careful in how you address this. If you assert or you speculate that the gigantic mass gatherings, which we were told were the most sizable mass gatherings to have broken out across the United States in 50 plus years since the 60s. That's what people were touting this as. So if that's true, then the denialists would have you believe that those enormous mass gatherings, which happen in every corner of the country, not every corner, but many corners, including far-flung corners in rural areas, which is amazing unto itself, which actually merits more attention sociologically and politically. But the denialists, the people who said that there's no possible connection between the protest and the spike we're now seeing in many places, they would have you believe that mass gatherings just no longer have any effect on transmission of the virus. In which case, why were we all scolded for 3 months to just, over our dead bodies, not participate in mass gatherings? Why was that an official policy all across the country to prohibit those mass gatherings? Was that just an error? No. It's still extremely likely that mass gatherings do facilitate the transmission of the virus. But there's now a political interest in denying that because you don't want the protests, which are mass gatherings, and unwieldy mass gatherings, notwithstanding the fact that many protesters do often wear masks. Wearing a mask doesn't protect you 100% to begin with, or it doesn't it doesn't impede your potential to transmit the virus 100% to begin with. It just mitigates it, and it mitigates it even less when you're crammed together like sardines in the middle of the street, chanting and screaming directly into one another's face, which is what happens at these protests. I don't know if you've attended any. I have many. That's what happens. Okay, there's no social distancing. So the denialists would have us believe that mass gatherings no longer have any effect on transmission of the virus, which again just runs 100% counter to everything that the public health quote-unquote experts and elected officials and the media and everybody essentially, including even Donald Trump, said for months prior to the George Floyd killing. So they just want cover. They just don't want the protest to be morally tarnished if you can attribute the transmission of the virus to those protests. And so you have, as expected, you have mixed evidence from around the country. Take, for example, Houston. Okay, so Houston on Friday issued an emergency order to everybody's smartphone, begging them to stay inside, to shelter in place. So we've returned in many parts of the country, including the third most populous county in the entire country, which is Harris County of Houston. People are being begged to stay indoors because they've reached a critical level in terms of the virus spread in Houston. Now, on June 8th, was it June 8th? Let me just pull that up. Okay, yeah. Actually, I don't have the exact date, but sometime in the past few weeks, 60,000 people crammed together in Houston for one of these mass protest gatherings. And if you look at the photos, I mean, give me a break. It's like the exact opposite of what we were encouraged to do for months. Opposite. Okay, and I don't care if it's outdoors. Being outdoors might lessen the likelihood of transmission somewhat, but we already know with certainty, because it's been confirmed and the protesters have said so publicly, that they were infected with COVID as they were at that event. Okay, so if you're screaming and chanting into somebody's face outdoors, you being outdoors is not going to negate that, based on everything that we know. I was even watching, and so when I point that out, that event in Houston, let me just make sure I have the date. Okay, June 3rd. June 2nd or 3rd? Okay, June 2nd. This was the 60,000 event, 60,000 protester event in Houston. Okay, so June 2nd, and it's now June 29th. We had the emergency conditions officially pronounced in Houston on June 26th. So that's around 3 weeks. Now, 3 weeks is pretty darn close to the incubation period you would expect before data enters into the public record related to virus transmission. So many of these, and we have an enormous, potentially catastrophic spike right now in Houston, okay? And the time period perfectly correlates with when the bulk of the protests occurred. Now, in suggesting that the protests were a factor, you're not precluding other factors. So if losers and idiots are going to bars right now that are jam-packed and drunkenly kind of like, spraying respiratory droplets into one another's faces, clearly that's also a factor. And clearly the incoherent messaging and public policy approach taken by many Republican governors in the Southwest and the South was probably harmful in meaningfully curbing the spread. I mean, now it's probably impossible. So in identifying the protest as a factor, you're not discounting that other factors were relevant here, okay? But if you already have a situation in Houston that is growing more viral to begin with, so to say, then the protests are like an accelerant. The protests exacerbate the problem. They add another factor which would worsen the spread on top of the whatever conditions existed anyway. And you know, occasionally you'll have these articles that people will send me, like from NPR or something, will say, "Parties, not protests, spread the virus." It's like, how do you know that, bitch? I mean, shut up. I don't need to read any of these articles because you know what? I can look at the data myself. I can go out and observe things myself. I don't need some 26-year-old blogger who's aggregating academic studies for NPR to tell me what is plausible in terms of the virus spread, okay? And if anything, I can read the study myself. And one thing you'll have people say is, "Ooh, there was no spike in New York City, so that means the protest couldn't have had any effect." Well, I mean, how do you know that, bitch? How do you know that? You don't know that. I'll pull up the info for New York City right now. It is true that after the New York City was the worst epicenter for the virus in the world, it has been on a downward trajectory since, since April. But hey, guess what? Just because there was no spike related to the protests doesn't mean that the protest has no effect. Because if you're on a downward trajectory, right, in terms of number of cases or the infection rate, then the protests could still have an effect even if they diminish the rate of the deceleration of the cases, right? Or in other words, if they cause the decrease in the cases to slow, right? So that's a possibility. Is it not? And forget, New York City is like an anomalous case because you have a lot more compliance in New York City and the surrounding area, like New Jersey, Connecticut, Westchester, etc., than you do in other parts of the country. Because we just went through this traumatic experience in the New York metropolitan region of the worst effects of the virus. And so, it can have a different effect in different places. I don't see why that's controversial. And, I can also bring up San Francisco, which curbed the virus to a meaningful extent with the relatively swift lockdown that was imposed. It was the first in the country. And San Francisco is not a place where you can blame some Republican governor, where you can blame a Republican mayor, or you can blame really any Republicans. There might be a couple someplace, but look, this is a jurisdiction that is overwhelmingly run by Democrats, okay, and highly progressive Democrats, quote unquote. And gee, who would have thought there is now a major spike in San Francisco? Can you see that? Yeah, I just showed you my computer screen. And to what do we attribute that? Well, I mean, it's possible that as some things were reopened, that contributed to it, but day after day in San Francisco and surrounding areas like Oakland, there were protests after protest after protest in the streets. And I'm sorry, if your contention to me is that could have had no impact whatsoever, then you're operating in some kind of voodoo land. You're just a dogmatist. And by the way, you're also anti-science, which you probably denounce Republicans for being, which sometimes they are, but you're also exhibiting that yourself. And I'm not saying every scientific official is like speaking the unvarnished word of God or something, but it's all the scientific evidence tells us that mass gatherings produce spread of the virus. I mean, that's why everybody around the world decided not to mass gather. It wasn't just the US, by the way. I mean, people can have an Americo-centric view on this, but like in India, I mean, why do you think Modi instituted a lockdown so quickly, nationwide, unprecedented? Because you couldn't have mass gatherings. And so now you see these upward ticks in many parts of the country. And, you know, I don't want to hear that some Republican is responsible for San Francisco. Are Republicans, do they bear some responsibility for other jurisdictions where they wield power? Yeah, Texas being an example. Although, you know, Harris County, Texas is not run by, is a relatively democratic part of the state, right? But, you know, I can pull up Florida here. And like, okay, does that seem like a positive trajectory in the Miami area to you? I mean, give me a break, people. And I don't want to hear any of you loser denialists who think that you're making a bold, defiant political statement by not wearing a mask or by saying just the flu, bro, even when Donald Trump over and over again and said it's not the flu, bro. When you try to cite Trump as your model in like being a clueless pandemic denier, even when he is responsible for endorsing many of the most harsh measures related to the pandemic over the past couple of months, I just don't want to hear it anymore. Because look, now we're stuck with this in perpetuity, and it didn't have to be this way. And there are a variety of causes. I think that the protests nuked any political legitimacy around virus containment measures. And that combined with the kind of economy first mentality of so many kind of like lame-brained Republicans was like a toxic stew. And now this is just what we're dealing with. Because like the situation worsening in Florida, Texas, Arizona, California, it's not going to say limited to those places. I mean, do you think we have no interstate travel in the U.S.? Do you think that people don't move around the country? I mean, it's just a joke. So, anyway, I've gone on long enough. Read the article that I'm about to put into the description box. And I'll do a separate video on this later. But I've decided with probably 90% certainty to extend my trip here and do a full country trip. So I'm going to go to Seattle. I'm going to go down to California, I'm going to go to Arizona, Texas, etc., and then home. So I'm extending the trip pretty substantially here. So if you appreciate anything I produce, obviously your contributions help make that possible. And that information is, yes, in the description box. Okay, talk to you all later.